Hey guys, I'm Raquel. Welcome to my channel Out of the Past, where I talk about all things classic movies. And this is the Classic Movie Roundup. Each week I talk about 3 classic movies that I watched, the film book I'm currently reading, and I follow that up with a wildcard segment of whatever piqued my interest. If that sounds good to you, keep watching for this week's episode. Excited to talk about the first movie this week, and that's Ladies They Talk About from 1933. This is a Warner Brothers pre-code starring Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck plays Nan Taylor. Nan is this glamorous gun moll who assists a team of bank robbers played by Lyle Talbot and Harold Huber. Her job is to divert attention away from her fellow gangsters by distracting others, most notably policemen and security guards, so that the gangsters can get away with the stolen goods. It's clear that she's a career criminal who is very confident in what she does. However, one unlucky day, she's caught and arrested. And this is where we're introduced to David Slade, played by Preston Foster. He's referred to as a hymn-shouting reformer. He leads these popular religious revivals and broadcasts them over the radio, and it's clear he has a lot of influence over the public and local politicians. He takes an interest in Nan and tries to use his influence to prevent her from going to jail. It's clear that he's fallen for Nan, but she's not quite sure about him. She ends up refusing his help and confessing her guilt, which lands her in the clink. Nan is transferred to San Quentin, which at the time in the 1930s was both a men's and women's prison. We see her interact with the wardens and with other women prison mates. She makes a few friends and a few enemies too. The story follows Nan as she learns to navigate the social politics of the prison, and as David Slade on the outside continues to pursue her romantically. While story-wise, Ladies They Talk About isn't all that great, it is still really interesting to see how it deals with the subject matter and looking for all those elements that make it a pre-code, which is a lot of fun. So the main draw in the movie is not the romantic storyline, but the women in prison element. There are quite a number of prison-themed pre-codes from this era. My personal favorite is The Big House from 1930 with Wallace Beery and Robert Montgomery and Chester Morris. And it was remade a couple times in other languages, which is really fun. The French one with Charles Boyer. And then there's also 20,000 Years in Sing Sing with Spencer Tracy and Bette Davis. And then like Paid with Joan Crawford, and I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, which isn't necessarily prison, it's more like outside of prison, but that one stars Paul Muniz from 1932. So prison movies were quite popular at the time, but Ladies They Talk About is the precursor to all of those like women in prison movies that were to come years later, especially in the 50s. You get Caged with Eleanor Parker, and you get Women's Prison with Ida Lupino as like this really sadistic prison warden. And then further on in the 70s, you get all of the exploitation films like Caged, Heat, and all of those like Roger Corman, low budget exploitation films that have women in prison. That became a really popular subgenre. But we all have Ladies They Talk About to thank for that, because this was really one of the very, very early films that showed women in prison. As in this time period, the women in prison trope was still fairly new. It was kind of titillating. Just so interesting to see women who were criminals and them all together in this jail and what they do. And the prison sequences are the biggest draw. They're so fun. It's quite funny to see how the women's cells are essentially little apartments. Like Barbara Stanwyck's cell is like decked out. She has a dresser and she has like flowers by the window. She has a little bed with fluffy pillows, like frilly pillows, and a doll. And she even has a gramophone where she can play like records and things. And they're all allowed to have lingerie and makeup. They all do their hair. One of them even keeps a pet dog. It's just so funny. And of course, I don't know if that's realistic at all, but it's kind of interesting to see that even though they're in prison uniforms, they still have like this like fancy lingerie and these fancy shoes underneath. And it's completely unrealistic. Like you wouldn't, like that's not something that would happen today and probably didn't happen back then, but the movie magic makes it really, really fun. And what's also interesting about the women in prison sequences in the film is like the motley crew of characters who are all part of Barbara Stanwyck's little world in there. You have Lillian Roth, who plays probably the most notable female character besides Barbara Stanwyck. She's Barbara Stanwyck's like sidekick and best friend. She's got some great lines. She's very spunky and no nonsense, and she really guides Barbara Stanwyck's character kind of through, like I said, the social politics of the prison. And it's really funny because there's this kind of odd sequence in it where Lillian Roth, who was, you know, famous for being a singer and then also an actress, she sings the song If I Could Be With You to a picture of Joe E. Brown that's like, oh, she's in her like prison cell and like all of these fellow prison mates are surrounding her and she's singing this love song to Joe E. Brown. And if you're a classic movie fan and you know who that is, you realize that is not necessarily somebody you would like fall for. But Lillian Roth is great, and she has some really great scenes in the movie. I love her character. There's also Maude Eburn, who I don't know very much about, but she has this really great small role as Aunt Maggie. She ran this brothel, and she's kind of like the older woman who basically, she doesn't run the place, but she has a lot of social power, which I think is interesting. Ruth Donnelly plays one of the prison wardens, and she's like a prison matron, and she has like this cockatoo she keeps on her shoulder. That was like so bizarre, but so interesting too, and kind of charming. Madame Sultewan, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correct. She has a small role as Mustard, and the name of the prisoner is Mustard. I don't know why. But there is a really interesting sequence with her where she is basically arguing with this woman who is clearly like of an elevated status. She's the one who was able to keep the dog, and they're arguing, and basically one is trying to instill social dominance over the other. But what's interesting is in the women's prison, that's all stripped away from you. You're all criminals. You're all pretty much equal. So it's really interesting how that particular scene kind of shows what they bring from the outside in to this space where the dynamics are completely different. So I thought that was interesting. There's also, which speaks to the pre-code element, there's actually a lesbian character. Dorothy ended up being convicted, and she went to San Quentin. And Paul also got convicted, and he went to San Quentin. So the play, which she wrote after she got out of prison, is based on her time in prison. Now, the storylines are not exact. I tried to look for the original play, and I couldn't find it. But if I do find it, I really want to see exactly how the storyline differs from the movie. So she wrote this play after she got out. She, I believe, performed the Barbara Stanwyck role herself on stage, and then the rights for this film were snapped up by Warner Brothers. And this was like a really good fit for Warner Brothers at the time because they were doing a lot of social issue movies, and this one you have like women and crime and, you know, like the incarceration and then like religious reform and all sorts of things. So it tackles a lot of different subjects. Paul Kelly gets out of jail or prison later on, and Dorothy's waiting for him, and they get married. And what's interesting is that what you couldn't get away with today is the fact that he ends up having a very long career in film, and Dorothy is able to write this play and sell it for film rights. And basically, she is essentially profiting off of her crime. And Paul Kelly's reputation isn't really hurt. He even just still uses his real name. And I just think that's super interesting. So if you're interested in watching Ladies They Talk About, It's available on Blu-ray from the Warner Archive collection. I have it right here. And this doesn't have anything really special about it. It's just a really good edition of the film. It's restored, so it looks really beautiful on Blu-ray. It has English subtitles, a theatrical trailer, and a Warner Brothers cartoon. So it's just kind of bare bones extras. This movie is also available on DVD from the Warner Archive collection in the Forbidden Hollywood series, which is this really popular collection of pre-code movies that they released. I believe there are 10 volumes in total. I have all 10. And each one has, I think, about 4 or 5 movies each. And this one has Hard to Handle, Ladies They Talk About, The Mind Reader, and Miss Pinkerton, which is kind of a fun murder mystery with Joan Blondell. You can also rent it on VOD. It's available on YouTube, Amazon Prime. Amazon Prime has a whole Warner Archive collection available for rental. And I know that TCM sometimes shows it, especially when they're showing pre-codes. The second film I'm talking about today is another pre-code. This is Backstreet from 1932. This film is set in Cincinnati in the early 1900s. Irene Dunne stars as Ray Schmidt. She's this young, beautiful woman who drives the local men crazy. While her dates aren't interested in anything long-term, there is one local guy, Kurt, played by George Meeker, who does want to marry her, but Ray's not interested. And it's at this point in the movie that the storyline of like automobiles and the advent of them and how they're starting to be used by regular folks as a mode of transportation really comes into play, because the Kurt character gets into the business even when the naysayers around him are telling him it's a bad idea. Now, instead of Kurt, Ray actually falls in love with this handsome young businessman named Walter Saxel, played by John Bowles. He is at the very, very beginning of his career, so the connections he makes are very, very important. And unfortunately for Ray, he's unavailable. He's in fact engaged. But he actually falls in love with her too and is considering breaking off his engagement and marrying Ray. But a sort of misunderstanding happens, which makes Walter marry his original fiancée rather than Ray. The story follows Walter and Ray as they reconnect and rekindle their romance over the years. Walter keeps Ray around as his mistress, and she follows him wherever his work takes him. She's absolutely devoted to him, but they can never be together publicly because of Walter's commitments. Ray is essentially a woman of the back street, quote unquote, someone tucked away and out of sight. She's never going to be someone on the main street of her lover's life. I really struggled with this one. For most of like the first half of the movie, I kept wanting to tell Irene Dunne, he's not worth it, he's not worth it. But as the film progresses, it's clear, especially as the characters get older, their romance deepens, and it's very clear how devoted they are to each other, even when both of them are not making the wisest choices. And there's a lot of frustration in the fact that, you know, the Walter character pretty much guides the relationship, and Ray is just kind of stuck following his whims and fancies, which is still frustrating. He keeps her at an arm's length throughout the film and then draws her back in, and that's just really, really frustrating. There's one point where it's clear that Ray is going to do the safe thing and get married to Kurt, even though she's not in love with him, because no one in the community takes her seriously because she's been dating around and she's had this, you know, affair with a married man. But Kurt is still in love with her, so they're about to get married, and guess who comes back in the picture? Walter. But the thing is even though Irene Dunne's character is basically blinded by her intense love for this man, she also is quite self-aware. There were two lines that stood out to me. One was, she says, "Do you know what I am?" And I think that was really interesting because she realizes that she is in a position as a woman who is unmarried, having an affair with a married man, and having had this history of dating, that puts her in a lower bracket and gives her less social power, which I think is interesting. And another line is, she says, "If I do go back, where will it all end?" And that makes me realize that she knows that this can't be forever, but she's holding on to it for as long as she can. It's a rather frustrating story, but you know, it is what it is. I do love Irene Dunne though, and I will watch her in anything. And even in movies that I wouldn't necessarily be drawn to. Like, for example, I remember Mama is fantastic and she's fantastic in it, but I would not have watched that film had it not been for Irene Dunne. So I will pretty much, like, any barrier to entry, if she's in the movie, I'll dive in. There's also like some interesting, I didn't necessarily care for John Bowles, but I did kind of like the other actors in the film. June Clyde plays Irene Dunne's half-sister, who has her own sort of romantic drama subplot that kind of parallels Ray's, which I think is interesting. Zazu Pitts has a very small role as Mrs. Dole. I wish it was a little bigger, but it's just such a delight to see her in anything. Jane Darwell has a really interesting small part, which basically she plays Irene Dunne's mother, Mrs. Schmidt. And she's this like stodgy older woman, pretty much thinks that, oh, automobiles will be out of fashion in 5 years. And she thinks that the younger generation won't pan out to anything. And she's sort of the symbol of like the older generation and their generational panic, always worried that new advancements and also the younger generations will be the destruction of everything. That's something that happens even today. So there's this one really great scene where Paul Weigel is reacting to what she's saying. He plays the father character, so they're a married couple. And this is the line that he says: "Ever since I can remember, the younger generation has been going to the dogs, yet somehow it always manages to come out on top." So listen to that, Jane Z. Don't listen to the old folks who are criticizing you. You're going to be okay. Interesting facts about Backstreet. It was remade in 1941 with Charles Boyer and Margaret Sullivan. And then it was remade again 20 years later in 1961 with Susan Hayward and John Gavin. The 1932 version, the one that I saw, was directed by John Stahl for Universal Pictures. The cinematographer Carl Freund, who famously worked on everything from like Metropolis to like I Love Lucy, he worked on Backstreet, and he invented the unchained camera technique, which made the movie camera more mobile. And I mean, I'm not an expert in this, so don't quote me on this. You can look it up yourself. But it was revolutionary for the time, and he does implement that in Backstreet, which I think is interesting. So Backstreet is based off of this right here, Backstreet by Fannie Hurst. So Fannie Hurst, she was a very interesting person, and Backstreet is loosely based off of her own relationship. She married this Russian emigre who was a pianist named Jacques Danielson, and they had a secret marriage, and I'm not really sure why it was secret, but basically they got married in private. She kept her name, Fannie Hurst. She didn't change her last name. They kept separate residences. And basically they were, she was publicly single, even and privately married for years until it was discovered and a scandal broke out because of it. And she was, even though they had this kind of strange relationship, she was absolutely devoted to him. And you can tell this just in the story what happened after his death. She would write him letters weekly, like every single week after he died, up until her death. And she always wore a calla lily in remembrance of him. So basically you could tell that the Ray Schmidt character is very much inspired by her own devotion for this man, which I think is interesting. This movie, as I said, is a pre-code, Backstreet from 1932. And this did run into some issues with the Hays office due to violations to the Hays Code. But that didn't really come about when it was released in 1932, because as anyone knows, in the pre-code era, this was the short era of time in Hollywood where the Hays Code guided exactly what could be shown subject-wise in films, but there was no proper way to enforce it. So a lot of studios were getting away with murder, and basically pushing the boundaries. And the pre-code era is like 1930 to mid 1934. And the further along you get in the pre-code era, the spicier the movies become, until everything's like cracked down in 1934, and then there's a sudden shift in exactly the content and what the characters can get away with in movies after that. So this one, when Universal wanted to re-release it, the Hays Code had to look at it again. The Hays office had to look at it again, and the fact that the movie does not hide the fact that, Irene Dunn's character was, sexually promiscuous, and that she was having a sexual affair with a married man, and they didn't like the whole kept woman thing, and that it wasn't just like that she was yearning for him. It was they were actually together in private. They didn't like that. And I'm not really sure what happened, but they did encounter a lot of issues. That could be why they remade the film, maybe to lessen the content. Now, Backstreet is available to stream on the Criterion channel. They have a really fun collection called Pre-Code Divas, and this was one of many films on there, and I highly recommend you check them out. There's some really wonderful pre-codes on there. One of my personal favorites, Safe in Hell, highly recommend you watch that one, is on there. You can also find the 1932 version of Backstreet. I believe there's a copy on YouTube. The Criterion one's going to be obviously a lot better, but this one, if you don't have the streaming service, definitely check that one out. It doesn't seem to be available on physical media, so if you're looking for a physical copy, you might have to check the gray market for this one. The next movie I'm talking about today is The House on Telegraph Hill from 1951. The film stars Valentina Cortese as Victoria. We see Victoria in a concentration camp in Belzin, Poland. Victoria has befriended a fellow prisoner, Karen, and when Karen dies and the prisoners are released, Victoria switches identities, and then Victoria becomes Karen. Much in the same vein as how John Hamm's character goes from being Dick Whitman to Don Draper in Mad Men. Think of it like that. Victoria sees an opportunity to live a better life by shedding her old one. We learn that Karen has a wealthy aunt in San Francisco who is caring for Karen's young son Christopher, played by Gordon Gebert. The family in San Francisco hasn't seen Karen in so long that Victoria could easily play her without being found out. On her way to San Francisco, she meets with Major Bennett, played by William Lundigan, who knows her true identity, but ends up becoming an important ally later in the movie. Victoria also learns that the aunt has passed away and that Karen's son Christopher is now under the guardianship of a distant relative, Alan Spender, played by Richard Basehart. Victoria and Alan are drawn to each other both romantically and physically, but also by their rather complicated situation. They marry and move into the family mansion. Victoria is tasked with concealing her true identity and keeping up the pretense that she is Christopher's mother. All the while, she feels very trapped in her new home. Margaret, the governess, played by Faye Baker, is controlling and wants to guide pretty much everything that happens with young Christopher. And Alan starts to become more and more distant. A series of events unfold that lead Victoria down a spiral of paranoia and fear. On Telegraph Hill is a film noir directed by Robert Weiss, who also directed The Setup from 1949 with Robert Ryan, which is not only one of my top favorite noirs, it's one of my top favorite movies of all time. So if you're interested in hearing me talk about that movie in particular, let me know in the comment section because I need an excuse to talk about that movie again. So The House on Telegraph Hill is a bit of a mixed bag. It's a bit cumbersome because the first half of the movie spends so much time introducing characters and setting up the situation for the audience, and that takes a lot of the momentum away. you really need the patience to get through all of that, essentially like world building, essentially. You need that patience to get through the first half, to get through the second half, which is a lot more enjoyable. And this is where the film shines, and it's also where the film noir elements come to play. There's like this wonderful slow build of tension. The characters start to become not what they seem. There's sort of like this secret that's lurking. You have more use of light and shadow. There's really like ominous figures in the background coming through doors. There's this destroyed playhouse that has this big gaping hole, and that opens up to like this treacherous drop down a hill. And the whole presence of that, it instills fear, and it kind of leads up to a particular scene. There's lots of shots of Valentina Cortese in various moments of fear. She doesn't overdo it, which is great, but you could still tell that she's like starting to really panic about her situation. And the camera shots, like towards the end of the film, especially when they're towards Richard Basehart, become more angular as his character starts to evolve. So I think it's interesting. Overall, this movie is very reminiscent of Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca, because you have essentially a woman moving into like this old mansion. She feels really suffocated. There's this other woman in the house that's like really cruel to her. And there's this pervasive fear that something bad is going to happen. So it's very similar to that. In fact, contemporary reviews of the time even noted the fact that it is very much like Rebecca. And it also reminded me a little bit of Laura from 1944, which is the Otto Preminger film noir, because that one and The House on Telegraph Hill have a painting that becomes an important plot point. More so in Laura, but to some extent in this film as well. And this one, the painting is of the deceased Aunt Sophia. And she's sort of like a ghost looking over the residence of the mansion. She sort of symbolizes like the hidden truth and the secrets, and that something more sinister is going on. She's dead, but like her ghost is like holding secrets in a way that that become more and more revealed. And it's almost like the painting is her wanting to warn Victoria what's happening, but she can't. So I thought that was really interesting how it's placed. And it's kind of like in Laura, where you have Jean Tierney and her painting is kind of overlooking the characters trying to figure out this murder mystery, and then things switch up. And the film House on Telegraph Hill sometimes is a little bit like Gaslight, where in that film you have Charles Boyer trying to convince his wife Ingrid Bergman that the things that she's thinking are really happening aren't really happening. He's trying to trick her that that she's going insane. And this one, Richard Basehart's trying to be like, everything's okay, when everything is really, really not okay. Which so basically, if you liked Rebecca, Laura, or Gaslight, you'll see elements of those films in this one. So shortly before production, Richard Basehart's wife passed away. She had been sick a long time, and she died, I believe, in July, and production started in September of 1950. And he wasn't sure if he was going to make a movie or go away somewhere, get a change of scenery, and take some time to mourn. So he wasn't sure, like, should I take this time off or should I keep busy and get my mind off of things? So he did decide to make this movie, obviously, because he's in it. And this is actually where he meets his second wife, who is Valentina Cortese, the Italian actress who plays Victoria in the movie. So they meet during the production of this film and fall in love. They married several months after the film wrapped. So pretty quickly, like within a year, like less than a year, his Richard Basehart's wife dies. He meets his second wife and marries her. And they married in private, but then it ended up becoming public. And he ended up moving to Italy with Valentina in order for them to be close to her elderly mother so they could take care of her. And that was the beginning of his transition to Italian film. He ended up being in some films with like Federico Fellini. And they had one son, and then they divorced in 1960. But he ended up remarrying later. And what I found was interesting too is that his third wife, Diana, they both started a nonprofit in 1971 called Actors and Others for Animals. And they were just really moved when they saw a dog being abused, and they wanted to do something with other actors who had some sort of influence in order to promote animal welfare. And this animal welfare charity is still in existence today. I'll link their website below, and I just think that's really interesting that he and his third wife started this, and I'm all about animal welfare, so I thought that was really admirable. Now the title, The House on Telegraph Hill, tells you that this is set in San Francisco, and it includes obviously Telegraph Hill itself. There's also several scenes shot next to Coit Tower, and there's a little backyard in which Victoria and Christopher play, and that's where the destroyed playhouse is. And I believe that's right next to Coit Tower. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not a San Francisco expert. There are also two places featured that no longer exist, which are Speedy's Grocery and Julius's Castle, which are two places that I believe closed within the last 10 years or so. So this becomes like a little time capsule of that era. And in the film, there's this terrific car crash sequence, and of course it's San Francisco, so you got these windy roads, and they're speeding, kind of like Bullet, and I don't want to ruin it for you, but it's just very satisfying to follow that, and how it ends is really interesting too. So this movie was based on a novel called The Frightened Child by Dana Lyon, and a lot of changes were made for the adaptation, which is pretty much common in the classic movie era for sure. It still happens today. So pretty much all the names from the novel were changed for the movie. Victoria in the movie was Anya in the book. Alan was Paul. Christopher was Eric. The novel doesn't have the identity swap storyline. It does have the Polish refugee concentration camp storyline, but there isn't a switched identity. And I'm glad they put that in the movie, because that does add a level of paranoia, which makes the movie quite interesting, especially in the second half. And in the novel, the married pair are really battling over the inheritance, to the point that I think they want to kill each other. And that's not really the plot in this. It's more sinister on one side than on the other. And inheritance only really comes up towards the end. It's not really Victoria's motivation. She doesn't want to get the money. She just wants a better life for herself, because she basically has nobody. Everything from her old life in Poland has been destroyed. So in the novel, the motivations are a little bit more different. And then the novel also tells the story in 3 points of view. You have the woman's point of view, the man's point of view, and then you have a third person who kind of does a third person narration. And it also sounds like the novel deals, obviously from the title, The Frightened Child, deals a lot more with the young boy and how he's caught in the middle of this contentious situation. So I just wanted to point out the child character in the movie, who doesn't have too much to do, and I wish there was more of a storyline there, but the child actor who plays Christopher in the film is actually Gordon Gebert. And I'm always delighted to see him in anything. And I actually got to meet Gordon Gebert last year at the TCM Classic Film Festival. He was there for a presentation for The Flame and the Arrow, which is this swashbuckling adventure film with Burt Lancaster, and Gordon Gebert plays Burt Lancaster's son. It's just a light, fun film. And he was there. I met him at the festival after party, and he was so nice. I gushed to him about how much I love him in Holiday Affair from 1949. It's one of my top favorite movies. It's in my top 5 favorite holiday movies. And anyways, I mean, a lot of us wanted to talk to him. We all told him how much we love Holiday Fair, and it was such a joy to talk to him. So it's now, after having met him, it's just so cool to see him in other movies and just be like, I met him. That was pretty cool. So if you want to watch The House on Telegraph Hill, it is currently available to stream on the Criterion channel as part of their November Noir lineup. And we're getting towards the end of November, and I don't believe this one is about to be removed by the end of the month, so it might stick around through December, but I would catch it when you can. It's also available to stream on Plex, but you do have to watch it with ads. You can also rent it from on VOD from like YouTube and elsewhere. And there is a made-on-demand DVD release that was produced from 20th Century Fox, which is still available. Those came out like several years ago, and I'm always surprised to see them online still for sale. So if you wanted to buy it on DVD, you can. Okay, I finally finished this book, so I'm happy to do a full review, and it's this one right here, aka Lucy, The Dynamic and Determined Life of Lucille Ball, by Sarah Royal, and with a foreword by Amy Poehler, and this is published by Running Press. And I'm very drawn to Lucille Ball. I love the fact that she had this chaotic energy that matched her femininity in a way that seemed like very natural, even though she herself said that she wasn't a natural comedian. She wasn't necessarily funny in real life, but she was just so driven, such a hard worker. She was so tenacious that she knew that she had this opportunity to become this famous comedian, and this was really where her career could go, and she took advantage of that, and she made a name for herself. And what I love about her is that she had this perfectionism that made what she did look natural when really there were hours and hours of work involved. And I'm also really inspired by the fact that whenever she had a dream, she went for it and she worked hard, and not everything necessarily panned out. Some things ended up opening doors to other opportunities, and she embraced that. And not everything's gonna last, but she went after all of her dreams, and I just really love that about her. So that's what kind of drew me to the book, and the book is absolutely gorgeous. Here's the cover. I love the little neon color touches that are on the cover and throughout the book. I think that makes visually it pop really well. You have this really striking image of Lucille Ball looking at us, and then her in a silhouette in profile, which I think is a really cool design. And this is the back right here. And this is a self-cover, hardcover, no dust jackets. So if you don't like dust jackets, you're good here. Beautiful end papers with lots of these little vignettes of Lucille Ball over the years, the same one in the back. And this isn't necessarily a traditional biography. I like to call it a celebration of Lucille Ball's life. So it has all these thematic chapters, and they go through all sorts of aspects of her life. It kind of goes in chronological order, but it also skips around too. So you have her early years in Jamestown, New York, how she got into show business, how she came to RKO, her early influences like Ginger Rogers and her mother Leela Rogers, how she came to meet and fall in love with Desi Arnaz, how they came to make I Love Lucy and develop Desilu Productions, how they had 2 children, Lucy and Desi Jr. And then it goes into other subjects like the fact that she was a feminist icon, even though she was a self-proclaimed non-feminist. The fact that she was accused of communist connections, but because of her immense fame and the fact that she wasn't really a communist, she was able to get out of that. And there was a line too about the fact that she might have brought an end to the Red Scare in Hollywood when they were pretty much trying to hunt down all the communists, which I thought was interesting. And then it goes into like the different aspects of her talents as a comedian, what made her so funny. It breaks down several episodes of I Love Lucy, what the famous scene is, how it came to be, what's the significance of it. Lots and lots of the book is about I Love Lucy being a groundbreaking show, how it was the fact that it was on 35 millimeters, so we got to keep it in a time where television shows were, shown on air and then they weren't recorded, so they disappeared into the ether. So the fact that we have that legacy, and the fact that that was one of like the first TV shows to become a rerun, was really interesting. And the fact that it was a show about a family, but she wasn't a demure housewife. She was a wife who really wanted to be in show business and had this tenacity. And so it really breaks it down. Lots of this one, see, this is like a timeline here. So some of the chapters just go through part of her life in your traditional like biographical form, and others are more thematic, based off of just breaking down a timeline of her life and career, or what exactly made her as famous as she was. See, like, I love the little neon touches. It's so beautiful. It's so beautifully designed. If you're into Lucille Ball's movie career, here's another interior shot. I love this. There's not like a ton of information on here. I was a bit disappointed that there was nothing about Yours, Mine, and Ours, which is my favorite Lucille Ball film. And there was just a little bit about the Long Long trailer. There was quite a bit about her time at RKO, which I thought was interesting. And there was a lot about her how Leela Rogers really guided her in her career. And I thought that was really interesting. She totally made her over. She gave her like really important career advice and really had her take off. And she felt very strongly, she felt like very strongly that Leela Rogers really helped her with her career. And it's funny, like at the end of the book, it discusses how like Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore and Carol Burnett were all incredibly inspired by Lucille Ball in their career. So it just kind of like shows how one generation passes down something to another generation, and then that keeps going. And I'm trying to think what else to talk about. Like, well, as I said, the focus is on I Love Lucy. So if you love the I Love Lucy show, there is a lot on here, a lot in here about it. It does go into a lot of detail about Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz's marriage. And this book is authorized by the Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz estate. So it's not going to be salacious. It's not going to reveal any like fantastic secrets. It's very gentle with the Desi Arnaz story. It touches very briefly upon, his cheating, his alcoholism, the fact that he really resented Lucille Ball for being the more famous of them two. And it does also touch upon how hard Lucille Ball tried to make the marriage work, from the fact that she insisted that he be in I Love Lucy, that they create the production company, Desilu, and basically his name is first in that. She insisted that the show I Love Lucy be filmed in Hollywood versus New York, where a lot of the TV production was happening, so that she could really put roots down in the California area, because they had purchased a ranch and she really wanted to start a family. She really, really wanted to make this marriage with Desi Arnaz work. So she did so many things, and still it didn't work out, and it just makes me really upset. The thing that made me the most upset was learning that their first child, Lucy, was actually going to be named Susan, after Susan Peters. And if anyone knows me, they know that Susan Peters is my favorite actress and one who I just am fascinated with. There's not a ton of information about her, but I'm always researching and trying to find out more about her. I've written a few pieces on her. She was an MGM actress who, at a very, very young age, was in a hunting accident that left her paralyzed, and she continued to have a career after that, but she really struggled with her disability and lots of like health issues. So Lucille Ball and Susan Peters were besties, and I was sad to learn that she was going to name the child Susan, so she was going to call Lucy Susan, but Desi Arnaz went and grabbed the birth certificate and signed it and filled out Lucy. And basically they had gone stuck with the name, and I was just really, really mad about that. I was like, how dare you? we could have had a Susan Arnaz instead of Lucy Arnaz. But of course, Lucy, the fact that they're both of their children had their names kind of passes along that legacy. So I guess I shouldn't be too mad. Although I did hear that Lucille Ball, after Susan Peters had her accident, was like so generous with her. She sent her food and made sure she was all taken care of, and did everything she could to help her. And I was just so struck by that. So I think that was really, really, really lovely, and I just love learning about that. In addition to learning about how just genuine a person Lucille Ball was, and how she was just like, it really never cemented in her how famous she was. She was always really surprised by her level of fame. So for me, this is a book for somebody who is really an I Love Lucy fan and really a Lucille Ball fan. So if you're looking for a book about her film career, this isn't really it. This is more about her personal life and her television career and how important that was. So I think, though, because of the beautiful packaging, it's very well written, it's engaging. Since it's not a traditional biography, it makes it even more engaging because you have all these different types of formats. That it would be a really good present for somebody. This would be a really good holiday gift or birthday gift for a Lucille Ball fan, or just somebody who really, really loves I Love Lucy. So for the wildcard segment, I'm going to keep it really quick. I do want to recommend that if you loved this book, aka Lucy, or you're going to check it out and you want something more, you want more Lucille Ball, please go listen to season 3 of Turner Classic Movies, The Plot Thickens podcast. Now that is some top-notch storytelling. It's several episodes and it goes through Lucille Ball's entire life and career. It's so engaging. The host, Ben Mankiewicz, does a really great job with it. But I'm telling you, the storytelling is just absolutely amazing. The team behind that podcast just does it so well. There's several seasons. There's, I believe, 4 seasons so far. The last one came out last year about Pam Grier. And they're all really interesting. I highly recommend them. There hasn't been one this year, but a friend of mine, Nikki, hi Nikki, she sent me a Facebook post that TCM had replied to, and they said that they are working on a new season of The Plot Thickens. And I was really worried that that podcast was going away, or it was sunsetting. TCM is starting a new podcast in conjunction with Max, formerly HBO Max. And Variety had just posted this article about it. It's called Talking Pictures, a Movie Memories podcast. And so TCM's Ben Mankiewicz sits down with like an actor or a filmmaker and basically talks about, their early film memories, what their favorite films were, what their influences were, what films are their guilty pleasures. So the Variety article, which I'll link down below, has all sorts of details about it. When I did hear the news, I was worried that The Plot Thickens was going to be replaced by this, but it's not. Both podcasts will exist, so I'm definitely going to check out the new podcast when it premieres. So, well, that's it for this week's episode. I hope you liked it. Thank you so much for everyone who's been giving me such great feedback. I really appreciate it. Make sure you like and subscribe, and make sure you binge watch the first 4 episodes too, if this is the first episode you're watching. Anyways, thanks for your support, and I'll see you next time. Bye.